My name is Ryan Gibson, and I'm going to share some research that's being done by myself, Jayden and Taylor Wilson. Unfortunately, Jayden and Taylor weren't able to be here today with us. They're grad students at the University of Guelph in the Rural Planning and Development program. But the research we wanted to share was looking at the evolving roles of rural economic development officers that are working in small communities, and to better understand what are their needs in terms of information, how do they get that information, the training that they might be needing, and what does the future hold for these positions? So what I'm going to share today is a little bit of background around where this project came from, our approach, and how we've been collecting information, some of the preliminary results that we're finding, and kind of our next steps as a bit of a calling card so that people can watch for further information in the coming weeks and months ahead. So this project all emerged from around 4 assumptions that we kept hearing from different senior levels of government in particular, but also sometimes in the literature. The first was that all rural communities were engaged in economic development activities. And we know that that doesn't always happen. The second assumption was that all rural communities had an economic development staff person or even a team of staff people. Now, if you have your own experiences, you might be able to relate to this, knowing that many communities may actually not have any economic development staff, or they might have an economic development officer who's also coordinating the ice rink schedule, the swimming pool lifeguard schedule, the public works. Then maybe they're the clerk on Tuesday mornings, but they may not have a full-time individual. The third assumption that we were coming across was that all rural communities have economic development budgets. So not only do they have staff, they actually have a budget dedicated to rural economic development. And the final assumption that we were hearing loudly from government was that the current economic development policies, and particularly the programmings, were meeting the expectations and the needs of rural communities. Another big assumption. These 4 assumptions have permeated throughout lots of public policy, they've permeated throughout lots of programming, and we really haven't had a systematic check of this in Ontario since the 1990s. That was the last time we really went back to rural communities and said, what are you doing in economic development in a systematic and comprehensive way? So hearing all of these assumptions and the frustration that rural communities have with these assumptions, we started to build a bit of a project that's funded by the Government of Ontario with 3 big goals. We're going to try to understand the key skills, capacities, and knowledges that are required by economic development practitioners in rural communities. So what do they need to do their job well? The second was to understand the roles and activities that they're actually doing and how we can support their prosperity, particularly in light of COVID-19 and all of these other transformations that have been taking place. And finally, we also wanted to evaluate the existing, I abbreviated it as KTT just to make space on the slide, but knowledge translation and transfer. How do we actually get research into the hands of practitioners that changes how they do their day-to-day activities or planning for future activities? So those were our key plans for this larger project. I'm going to share a piece of this project with you, so we won't be able to cover all of these goals, but if you're interested, you can stay tuned and we'll have lots more information in the coming months ahead. Just to give you a quick highlight, some of the key themes that were coming out of the literature. As I said, the last comprehensive, wide-scale understanding of rural economic development was done in Ontario in the 1990s by David Douglas. They did a comprehensive study, and really important work came out of that. But since that time, we've had these assumptions about what's still happening. More recently, Goodwin Arcou out of Western Ontario did a lovely survey that found that about 60% of economic development is actually done by local governments in Ontario. The rest is done by a collection of nonprofit organizations, community future development organizations. It might even be voluntary organizations that are out there. So it's not just local governments. So if we're making the assumption that local governments are the sole provider of economic development, we're missing about 40% of what's happening. In rural Ontario, in all of Ontario, most of the primary focus for economic development is on manufacturing. Those that have plans, it's manufacturing. There's a little bit around retail and service delivery, and even a smaller amount on tourism, but for the most part, when we're talking about economic development plans, we're talking about manufacturing plans. And the barriers were quite substantive. About 73% of local governments in Ontario say the availability of land is the biggest barrier for their economic development. Funding and access to financial capital being over half of the communities. And also half of the communities indicated that they have a lack of skilled capital. They have difficulty finding workers, either to work in businesses in their community or even to work as economic development officers. Heather Hall and Tara Vinodre more recently did a wonderful piece of work looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on rural economic development. And it was really interesting that they were asking about the budgets. So almost 1 in 10 communities in Canada that participated in the survey have no budget for economic development whatsoever. They have no annual budget to do economic development. And in the pandemic, about 1 in 3 communities actually saw their economic development budget decreased or reallocated completely. So we know that when funding is even available, it often is precarious. It can come and go at the whim of an elected council. So with all of this background, these assumptions, these themes from the literature, we've been using a absorptive capacity theory to better understand how this is happening. And if you're not familiar, this is a theory that looks at an organization's ability to recognize the value of new external knowledge, to be able to assimilate it, to digest it, to find its application or its relevance for their own organization, and then to apply it, to transform things, to actually influence their practice as they move forward. So we've used this kind of model around acquisition of new knowledge, how they assimilate this new knowledge, and how they transform or adapt the province. So we have done, in our first round, a series of 38 interviews via telephone with local government officials in rural communities. And we've been trying to better understand, what are they doing? What activities are their offices actually doing? Actually changed. Have had some lovely conversations. We've transcribed all of these and we've been analyzing it for themes. We've had to go through and change some of the wording as we received some lovely, colorful commentary around the situation. So we've had to, but 38 rural economic development, all of these communities had an economic development officer, at least at a part-time basis. So these results I'll share don't represent communities that don't have an economic development officer. So some preliminary findings that we've got here. First, it was around activities. Loud and clear, the largest activity that rural economic development officers are working on is workforce attraction and retention. They're looking at trying to find new businesses. They're looking at keeping the existing businesses, helping existing businesses grow, and trying to find workers. This is the top priority. However, almost every single interview indicated that although workforce development is their top priority, housing and transportation are the bottlenecks that are preventing workforce development and retention from being successful. So although workforce development and retention is the top priority, the lack of available housing, affordable housing, and transportation, particularly inter-community transportation, is critical. They can find workers perhaps in the neighboring community to drive over, but there's no transportation to get people from point A to point B. Or if there is transportation, it's not appropriate for the hours that the business is working or the time of day. So that was by far the largest activity. But we saw a whole variety of different activities, whether it was around immigration, building on our conversation from this morning, networking events, looking at partnership job fairs. Economic development offices were doing a whole raft of different activities. We also see some work around aging and youth in this front. So we had one county in particular that had a very interesting strategy about re-engaging seniors in the community who had retired into part-time work and opportunities that allowed businesses to bring on skill sets that they maybe needed but didn't have access to and weren't maybe looking for a full-time employee. In terms of funding, this was a fascinating conversation. We found that the annual budget ranged from zero. We had almost a third of communities saying they have no budget allocated to them every year, but they operated in this wonderful environment where they needed to actually create a whole bunch of outcomes on behalf of the council, their elected government, saying this is your responsibilities, these are the priorities, but you have no budget to actually do it. Good luck. Most of them at the high end, sorry, not most of them, we had one community that had $100,000 in an annual budget and they had fairly large security in that. It had been happening for many years. But over half of the communities reported that they are relying on annual grant funding. So every year they're writing grants to try to kind of sing for your dinner, keep the job, and kind of do activities, but they don't have any security in their funding. We also heard very loud and clear about this notion of collaboration and partnerships. And the comment came out of one of our interviews saying that collaboration was a survival strategy. Because they have very limited budget, they often have part-time staff, that collaboration was the only way to actually get things done. It allowed them to leverage their funding. It allowed them to be able to achieve outcomes that they couldn't achieve on their own. But that they had no resources for doing the partnering and the collaboration. So it was really kind of a coalition of the willing. We also saw the comment coming out when we asked around what kind of skills do people need to be successful. We saw that they need to be a multi-skilled generalist. They need to do everything. And this was complicated by the fact that many economic development officers are not full-time positions. They're part-time positions. Maybe they have another part-time position in the local government, and so that other position might dictate what skill sets are necessary to do the job. So we heard everything from budgeting and team working to grant writing, communication skills, networking skills, data analysis, GIS, and navigating and surviving the navigation of government programming and government language. And we also heard lots of comments around building presentations and communicating in plain language. All really critical skills. So there was this delicate balancing act around technical knowledge as well as community engagement that really needed to be available in the jobs. We also discovered that almost half of the participants say they had no previous rural economic development training before entering the job. They may have worked in the voluntary nonprofit sector, maybe they worked in accounting, but they didn't come in with a university degree in economic development. They didn't come in with training or workshops in this field. And so it really meant there was a lot of on-the-job learning. And that became really clear as a challenge, is that most of these offices indicated they had no budget for training. Most of the training available is in the urban center, and they have no budget to travel. And even when the training is offered online, and there was a great example, the one community wanted to participate in the Stats Canada Building Online Surveys training, and it was $900 for the 3-day course. And so they just are struggling that even though training is online, and after COVID-19 we see that, they've not been able to access that. So in terms of COVID-19, we saw all sorts of stories that came out here in terms of accelerated innovation that was taking place in the community, but also fragility to the economic development system, and that many economic development officers were reassigned during COVID-19 to public works and navigating the COVID-19 realities. So the last findings I wanted to share here was just back to this adaptive capacity theory. We started to see that there's a clear recognition of the need for external knowledge. Rural economic development officers were saying they're looking for it, they're trying to find it, whether it's Stats Canada data, whether it's something else, they're actively looking for it. When it came to assimilating that knowledge and actually integrating it into their practice, this is where we got mixed reactions and mixed experiences. It was often dependent on the local capacity of the individual, but we saw challenges around where to find rural information, how to use it, how to deal with things like data suppression for small data, how to separate one community from a larger set of a region on that front. And we also saw a very large frustration that emerged from many economic development officers in the fact that they would often go out looking for new data to integrate it in, and when they presented evidence-based decisions to councils or to senior levels of government, they were ignored. So all of the time they spent in trying to navigate, find, integrate the data, all was for naught because the council or the provincial government didn't adopt their recommendation. Incredibly challenging. And maybe just to wrap up here, before Gary gives me the hook, is that the next steps on this project, one of the key messages that we found from this first phase is that rural economic development actors are being shaped by constructural constraints, the funding, the geography, the transportation, but they're being sustained by resourcefulness. It's not the funding that's sustaining them, it's the resourcefulness of the people in those positions. And the survey to all 440 municipalities to better understand the activities that they're undertaking. Hopefully we can share that with folks at next year's SURF. And if at any time you want more information, you can go to the ruraldev.ca webpage. There's some information and some resources that are listed there. But I'm going to leave it there. Happy to answer any questions if there's still some time. And hopefully that all made sense.